the assignment for today was some background information, and there are some terms and some key elements to that that I want to explain because there are some kind of confusing parts about Beowulf when you're reading it that this introduction section explains. So one of the things is that the textbook talks about the language Old English, and that's a really general term. So we've since started using the term Anglo-Saxon. So if you see Old English, really that's kind of an old-fashioned term for the language that this material was originally written in. And so you'll hear me talk about Anglo-Saxon as a language, and it's the same thing as Old English. It's just that Old English is too general. Anglo-Saxon locates the language very specifically to a certain group of people who originated the English language. So that's in there a couple times, and I just wanted to point that out to you. Another distinction to make that gets a little bit intertwined in the text of Beowulf is the pagan versus the Christian world. And the text does talk about that. Specifically, they talk about the pagan world of the ancient people. So let me just clarify that a little bit on a timeline situation. We think of Christianity as something that began, in year, I don't know, 33, whenever Christ was on the planet. But it's not something that was spreading and pervasive immediately. It took hundreds, thousands of years for Christianity to build a momentum. And so the people who originated the story of Beowulf, Beowulf is a legend that predates written language. So the people who had this as a legend and told it orally for years and years and years before it was finally written down, when there was written language for that language, they were not Christian because there was no Christian influence in their area. So they're what we call pagan. They worshiped they're multi-theistic. They had many gods. They had a god of the trees and a god of the woods and a god of, the home and, goats and all that stuff. So when this legend was finally written down after generations of it being told, to the next generation and passed down like that, then the person that we believe wrote Beowulf down finally in the Anglo-Saxon language was a Christian monk. And so he would have been influenced by Christianity. And so he added those elements to the story as he was writing it down. So it's a pagan story. It's just been sort of Christianized because of the person or people who actually wrote it down. Now, why would somebody do that? Nowadays, if somebody did that and took, an original text and added a whole bunch of religious overtones to it, that would be cultural appropriation. We would think that that was an egregious error. But in older times, the Middle Ages, it was a function of conversion. If somebody is trying to convert some pagans into Christianity, one of the tactics they're going to use is to piggyback the Christian concept onto the concepts that the people currently believe in. Not too many people are too keen about changing religion overnight. If somebody knocked on your door and said, hello, you're not going to be whatever you believe in anymore, now you're going to do this thing. Most people have a deeper connection to their spiritual life that they're not going to be like, oh, okay. Most people are going to be skeptical. It's going to take some time, maybe even a couple generations before that religious belief starts to be pervasive for them. So, so it's the same way. The Christian influence didn't really happen overnight, and monks would use literature and the people's original stories and piggyback them off of the Christian story. They would say, okay, so in your culture, who is your greatest hero? Who's the person that's top of the line? Oh, well, it's so and so. Okay, well, Jesus is kind of like that. And so then they would piggyback the Christian concepts onto the pagan or, you know, non-Christian beliefs and kind of move them toward that in that way. So so it gets a little hairy when we read in Beowulf that they did pagan rituals, but God blessed them. So which is it? Are they pagan or are they Christian? So I just wanted to make sure that I clarified that for you as you're reading so that you can distinguish the difference between the original legend and the way that it was written down. Another point of clarification is the text talks about how the irony and the fact that the first work in what we can call English in Anglo-Saxon is really not even an English story. It's a story that comes from Denmark. And if you watch that introductory video, I had some maps and talked about the different tribes and groups that migrated to Britain and how that worked. So they brought with them their stories, and eventually their language intermixed with the indigenous people and the Latin people who were left from the Roman Empire, and the Anglo-Saxon language was born. So the story is originally a Danish legend. So when we're talking about location and setting, it's all in Scandinavia, this whole story. And so you might be thinking, well, how is that British? And so the video kind of explains how that migration occurred. This line is just another reinforcing line about the Christian aspects of the poem. Okay, there's a term on, well, the PDF page 31. There's a term that you need to know called weirgild. Weirgild is sort of the concept of revenge, but it's got a price tag on it. And we see it a lot in Beowulf, and that's why it's mentioned here in the intro. Even the part that we read today, there's a lot of this idea of, if you take one of my men and kill him, then I need recompense for that. You can't just come and take somebody without expecting to have to pay something in return. Either you're going to pay by taking a life of the other person's people, or you're going to pay money or items or something. There has to be a recompense for the killing of someone. And so the idea is pretty common. I mean, it's revenge, right? It's, if you take one of mine, I'm going to take one of yours. And I don't think that that's something that's died out. We still have that concept. We have a society that's a little more refined in that, you know, we have legal system and we have jails and we have court proceedings and we have all of these things to help us get that recompense. But in these ancient times, there's no police, there's no government, there's nothing controlling anything. And so weirgild is the idea that you're allowed to go and take from the person who took from you. And that's why Beowulf is there to kill Grendel. Grendel's been taking from the Danes for 12 years. And so his death is not something to be mourned. Same thing when later on, one of Hrothgar's advisors is going to be killed, and Beowulf will advise to immediately go and get that person that killed him. And that's just that concept. It's just that it's a little more barbaric in Beowulf because it was more barbarous, you know, more of a barbarous time than we have today. Okay. At the bottom of this page, I really like this description of the mood of Beowulf, and I wanted to make sure that you had notes on that if you didn't already when you were reading. So when the text says that Beowulf pervades a mood that is somber and dignified, an elegiac mood, I wanted to explain what that means. I mean, I know you know what somber and dignified means, but elegiac goes along with that. And that's important to remember that quality when we're talking about the text of Beowulf, because somber and dignified is like, you know, serious and respectful, because this whole work is called Beowulf because he's the hero that they wanted to remember. And so they told his story for generations orally so that it would remain you know, and not be lost to time until it could finally be written down around 700, or some scholars say the year right around 1000. So the elegiac mood, it's an elegy, and we talked about elegy first semester when we were doing poetry in terms of forms of poetry, but it's used here in the same way. Beowulf, if he was real, is dead, long dead. And whoever's writing this is sort of like remembering him fondly. And so this is like a tribute to him. An elegy is a poem that's written to remember somebody who's passed away. So if you have someone who is writing an elegy, it means that they're contributing to this sort of historic element of keeping this person's memory alive by memorializing them in poetry. Also in your reading, there's a mention here about Seamus Heaney, and I want to make the point, and you can add this to your notes too, that Seamus Heaney is not the author of Beowulf. Beowulf, we don't know who it was that wrote it down. We think it might have been 2 or 3 different monks. They analyzed the handwriting and everything. But Seamus Heaney, along with many others, decided to translate the original text. Seamus Heaney was a modern man, a poet. He died in 2013. So he's not the author of Beowulf. We just usually say the Beowulf poet, or, it's anonymous. But Seamus Heaney took a poet's eye back to the original text. And so a lot of people say this is the best version of Beowulf because it captures that poetic excitement and the poetic drama of Beowulf, where other people just said, Beowulf fought with a monster. Moving on. Seamus Heaney kind of talks about how the sinews are stretching and snapping, and he adds all of that poetic development to his translation. So it's just important to remember that Seamus Heaney is not the author. We just say the Beowulf poet. Okay, on page 32 of your text, you will note that there's this listing of tribes and genealogies, but when that translated into the PDF, it came out all kind of weird and broken. So if you go to the temporary website, this one that I showed you on Tuesday for these first few weeks before Blackboard is enabled, I put in a link right here of those genealogical elements, and they're important for your reading in a couple of ways. So I'm going to click on it. You can make a copy for yourself if you want, or you can just remember that it's there and go back and access it. But this is what it's supposed to look like. The PDF, whoa. Okay. The PDF kind of didn't get the lines in there and stuff. So let me talk about what this is and how it's going to help you with your reading. When you were reading the first part of Beowulf, you probably noticed that the names are a little hard to remember. They do have strange names. I gave you that pronunciation thing in the video to help you with that. But one of the other issues isn't pronunciation. One of the other issues is that because this was an oral culture, and because they were telling their stories only verbally, there are a lot of places where characters are referenced multiple ways. So for example, sometimes the character Hrothgar, he's the king of the Danes, right, who's having the trouble with Grendel. Hrothgar is sometimes called the son of Halfdana. And if you don't know that Hrothgar is the son of Halfdana, you might think that son of Halfdana and Hrothgar are 2 different characters. And they're not, they're the same person. Same thing with Beowulf. Beowulf is sometimes called Hygelac kinsman. And that's because you can see down here in the Geat matrix here that Hygelac is the king of the Geats at the time of the story, and Beowulf is his nephew. So the way this works is you've got the generations. So at the top here is Shield Chieftain. His son is Beo. His son is Halfdana, and then his son is Hrothgar. So this vertical element shows the generations, and then the horizontal shows siblings. So Hrothgar had a brother Hrothgar, a brother Helga, and a sister that wasn't worth mentioning because of the way that their society worked. Same thing here. Beowulf is the son of Ecgtheow and some woman who was the sister of Hygelac. So sometimes Beowulf is called son of Ecgtheow. It doesn't say Beowulf, comma, son of Ecgtheow. It just says son of Ecgtheow, and you're supposed to know that means the same thing as Beowulf. Or Hygelac kinsman. They mean Beowulf because he's his nephew. So what gets a little bit confusing is not just the names, but the fact that the way that they referred to people oftentimes had to do with their ancestors. And that's another form of trying to keep their history and their stories alive. If you don't have a way to make birth certificates because there's no written language, then the only thing you can do is keep referring to people, you know, son of so-and-so, grandson of so-and-so, kinsman of so-and-so, so that your history can somehow survive. So I wanted to make sure that you had that, a better copy of that diagram, because I think it will help you, especially, you know, as you're reading at the beginning, to kind of in your mind get set who's who. They do give you a little snippet here of Anglo-Saxon so that you can see what that language looks like, and you can see underneath it they're translating. So you can see there what it looks like. There's also in the video for today that you watched on Anglo-Saxon literature, I showed an example from Beowulf 2 in Anglo-Saxon. You can just see that it's a completely different looking language. I think if you study Anglo-Saxon, you're basically studying another language, even though it's the origin of English. I already talked about that. All right, if there are any questions about the first part, that background information, you can go ahead and put them in the chat, or you can unmute. If you put it in the chat, then I'll touch on it before we finish up for today. So you should have read about the first, not quite half of Beowulf for today. I'm going to go through that section. I'm not going to touch on everything that's happening because I'm assuming that you read it. At first, it's a bit of a challenge to read because it's an epic poem, and so the structure of it's a little different. And there's sometimes a few words that you might have to look up, but this version does a really good job with footnotes. So hopefully you're reading your footnotes at the bottom here. I'm just going to touch on some of the main points as we go through. And if I skip over something that you were wondering about, then just go ahead and you can send me a private message, or you can just put it in the chat, and I will make sure that I touch on it before we go. So the first part, Beowulf begins with a prologue, which describes the rise of the Danish nation. So there's a whole lot of genealogy. Why do they do that? Same reason. They need to establish their history. They don't have a written history, these people, so they need to sort of explain it. But there's another reason too, and I'll get to that in a minute, why you would want to know that Hrothgar was descended from Shield Chieftain. So it starts with the idea that the originator of the Danes is a man named Shield Chieftain, and Shield Chieftain began the country of Denmark. The legend is that he arrived in a boat as a baby by himself, and he came to the shore of what's now Denmark, and he created the nation of Denmark. I don't know why I always picture a little baby, like a little buff baby rowing in his boat, but that's not it. It's probably more like Moses in the basket from the Bible. But he's an orphan, and so the idea is that he comes from unknown origins and creates this great nation of Denmark. And so they describe him and his great kingdom that he created. There's a lot of glowing elements there about that. He had a son named Beo, no relation to Beowulf, by the way. And he was sent as a comfort by God. So here's one of those references I was telling you about, the Christian influence that has been, you know, sort of fused with Beowulf because of the translator being a monk. So there's that, there's Lord of Life, the Almighty, all of those things, those Christian elements that are added on after the legend already existed. So then Beowulf becomes king, Shield dies, and there's a description, a long description of his funeral, which is pretty elaborate and very different from the Christian tradition. So you can tell that they're pagan. What they do is they put Shield, he dies of old age, and they put him in a fine ship, and they surround him with all of his treasure and his you know, his armor and all of those sorts of things to go into his next life with him, and his coats of mail. If you don't know what mail is, it's not anything that gets delivered. They didn't have writing, so they didn't have mail. But the chainmail. So chainmail is really fine circles of metal that are all welded in to make chains, and it's all combined into almost like a fabric. And they would wear these suits made of chainmail as sort of, I guess, ancient Kevlar, so that if they get stabbed by a sword, the sword can't penetrate into the person's body. So he's put onto the ship with all of his great weapons and everything that he's amassed over his life, and set out to sea. And then at sunset, and they light it on fire with some flaming um, flaming arrows, and it sinks, and that's his final resting place. So it's very clearly a Viking funeral, pagan ritual. There's another funeral that will be described at the very end. Beowulf starts with the funeral and ends with the funeral. The ending funeral will be Beowulf's funeral. He's not going to survive. If he was real, he didn't live indefinitely. All right, so then Beo becomes king. He has a son. They describe sort of like the generations pretty quickly after that. Halfdana is Beo's son, and then Halfdana's son is Hrothgar. So one of the reasons that they go through this, I've already mentioned. The other reason is because they want you to understand that Hrothgar comes from a line of great men. So the assumption is that if you are the son of Halfdane, who's the son of Beo, who's the son of Shield Chieftain, that the blood, the mighty blood that runs through the veins of Shield Chieftain now runs through the blood of Hrothgar. So just by lineage, he's a great king. He is a great king. He does some great things for the people, and we'll talk about that when we get to the mead hall. But the idea is that he is descended from greatness, and so he must therefore be great. It's the same thing with Grendel. Grendel's descended from Cain's clan, right? Grendel's the monster that's attacking. We'll talk about the biblical allusion there. But if you're a descendant of Cain, then Cain's evil blood runs through your veins. And so Grendel, being a descendant of Cain, carries forth that same evil gene, that same evil blood in his veins. And so the idea that part of the reason that they mention all this genealogy is to associate the characters with their progenitors, to say that this person must have these intrinsic qualities because of who he is. All right, so what did Hrothgar do that was so great? Hrothgar is the featured character at this point in the story because he's the king of the Danes. And his greatness lies in his ability to expand the realm of the Danish people. And also he created a mead hall, which is called Harrot. And I highlighted them here on line 69 and also on 78. So to us, building a hall is not that big of a deal. Mead hall is just a place where people went to go drink mead. Mead is a fermented drink made of honey, fermented honey. So it's an alcoholic beverage. And so all these people went to this hall, Harrot, in order to commune with one another. And that's a new concept in this culture. Up until then, they had pretty much lived in their own houses wherever. There's no deeds or land. They just built a house where they wanted to build a house. There's no territory. There's no, here, pay off this land. You just built your house and you raised your goats or your crops or whatever it was. And if somebody wanted to come and take it, they just took it. They killed you and took your property. If you had somebody who could perform weird, then they could go and get retribution. But other than that, they could just live in your house. Well, what would prevent people from doing that? Nothing. There's no police. There's nobody to call. There's no court. There's no lawyers. There's no government. But when Hrothgar built the mead hall and invited people to come to it, it's the beginning of the sense of community, right? we can work together to expand our civilization. We can work together to protect each other. We can maybe create an army, or like at least a protection for ourselves. We can start to work together to make life a little bit easier. When I'm having trouble, you can help me. And so the mead hall brings everybody together into a community pretty much for the first time in this culture. Other cultures, they had things like that. You could go to the Romans and they definitely had those elements, but these people did not. And so they're coming from their barbaric world into a more civilized world. And so the mead hall really represents that sense of community that they're able to have now. Which is why when Grendel starts to attack it in the second section, it's so horrible. Not only is Grendel like killing 30 men, 30 Viking warriors at a time, he's also, taking away their ability to have that community that they built up with the mead hall, because they close the mead hall. That's where Grendel attacks, and so they close it. And so symbolically, that represents the fact that Grendel is causing their world to be stunted. They're not allowed to continue growing in their community and supporting each other because that mead hall has been closed based on his attacks. So all of his attacks are described here, and his movements, the way he prowls through the dark, and he sort of like glowers through the mist, and his sort of animalistic ways. And we get here on line 106 the reference to him being part of Cain's clan. And I mentioned that in terms of genealogy, but let me also mention that in terms of biblical allusion. So Cain's clan is the idea that in the Bible, maybe you know this Bible story, in the Bible, Cain and Abel are the children of Adam and Eve. And Cain gets jealous of Abel's offering to God and kills him. He kills his own brother. So it's the first murder in the Bible, and it's fratricide. He kills his own brother. And of course, this upsets God, and he's exiled from the rest of humanity. So Cain goes and lives elsewhere. He's an outsider and isolated from the love of God and also from humanity. And he, just goes away. But here we have reference to it to show just how evil Grendel is. He's like several generations ingrained evil is how bad he is. And so when we see Cain's clan, we're supposed to, sort of reference that in our mind and think how evil this fiend is. He starts attacking the mead hall, and they describe that it's very gory and detailed about how he goes in and he rips the men apart and gobbles them down like snacks, and he can get 30 at a time, just like you would pick up some Cheetos or something out of a bowl. Hopefully you're not eating 30 Cheetos, but yeah, so he snacks on them and how he butchers them and rips them. This is like the good stuff, right? This is the part of the story, I hate to say it, but it's the exciting part, and how he attacks them. And so on line 145, because he does this over and over again, they have to close the mead hall. Grendel never does learn to go anyplace else to get them. They close the mead hall, and the suggestion in the text, I don't know if I can find the line, is that it bothered him to hear them in the mead hall. Right here. It harrowed him, this is line 88. It harrowed him to hear the din of the loud banquet every day in the hall, the harp and the poet. He didn't like that they were congregating together, that they were, they didn't invite him, obviously, because he's an outsider. So that's part of the reason that he's motivated. And so they close the mead hall, and for 12 winters, he can go in there and he messes around in the mead hall. He can't ever sit in the throne because that is controlled by God, but he, takes over the mead hall, and the people don't go there anymore, which changes the focus of their community. Here's the line where it talks about how he took over Herod. Here's where we have some more influence of pagan. So the Beowulf poet, interestingly enough, rites that they prayed to the pagan shrines about the scourge of Grendel and how he's hurting them so much. They go to their pagan shrines, but the Beowulf poet, being a Christian, says it didn't work because the only prayer that works is the Christian prayer. He's trying to emphasize that, so it didn't work. All right, I still don't see anything in the chat, so I'm assuming that you're all with me. The hero comes to Herod. So Beowulf, we kind of switch gears at this point, and we find out that Beowulf has heard about this terrible situation over in Denmark. Beowulf lives in Geatland, which is on the southern part of Sweden at this time. They don't exist anymore, Geats. The Swedes invaded them and made it Sweden. But anyway, so he hears about this terrible monster that's besetting the people of Hrothgar, and the affliction for Halfdane's son, that's Hrothgar. And so Higelac Thane, Beowulf, decides to go and see if he can help. So here's an example of that, language shift for the characters' names. So he gets his ship and he sets out to go to Denmark. And he gets some men and they get on their ship, and it's very descriptive about the waves and how she flew swiftly. And, Beowulf's boat is even heroic as he's traversing over to Denmark. They get there and they thanked God that they made it and all of that stuff. And when they get there, there's a guard. There's like somebody who's on lookout, and he sees the ship approaching, and Beowulf and his men land, and they get out of the boat and they approach this guard. And we have some characterization now of Beowulf. We have a little bit before that because he, on his own, decides to go and help this king. He's not requested or anything like that, and that tells us something about his character. But when he gets there, he's very respectful, not just to Hrothgar himself, but also to these guards, because he knows they're dressed in battle gear. They have their helmets on, they have their chainmail and their plate armor, and they've got their weapons. And so this guard is kind of like, who are you and what do you want? Like, halt, who goes there type thing. And Beowulf, this is where he says, what kind of men are you who arrive rigged out for combat? Are you here to attack us? And if so, you basically don't have enough men. And Beowulf says, we're the people of Lord Higelac. He's very patient with explaining who they are and why they've come. We're not here to hurt you, we're here to help you. And I have come to talk to the son of Halfdane. I come to proffer, this is line 277. I come to proffer my wholehearted help and counsel. I can show the wise Hrothgar a way to defeat his enemy and find respite. And so this guard goes, okay, well, that's good because we've had this monster for a while. Come with me. And he takes him, sort of over into where the king is. And let me see, where's the next part that I highlighted? Yeah, this is at the top of written page 41. So then there's another guard at the building where Hrothgar is, and that guard, his name's Wolfgar, but I don't think there's any test question about that. And he says, who are you? You're dressed for battle. We're suspicious of you, and so on. And Beowulf again is patient, and he says, we're the retainers of Lord Higelac. We've come to talk to Hrothgar. So he goes through that process a couple of times very patiently, because he knows that it's barbaric times. If you look like you're going to attack, they'll probably attack you first. So he uses his dialogue and he explains who he is and what he's doing there. This guard goes into Hrothgar and says, hey, there's this man here who says that he's here to kill Grendel, and his name is Beowulf, and that you know his dad. And Hrothgar acknowledges that he knew Ecgtheow, Beowulf's father. He said, I used to know him. His father came here when he was in trouble. And this is a good note to make. I didn't put it in the margin here, but this is a good note to make because it's revealed here and also in the discussion that Beowulf has with Hrothgar that one of the reasons Beowulf has come there is because because of his relationship with Hrothgar. Beowulf's dad was in trouble, owed some money, was exiled, and Hrothgar helped him and gave him some money and got him back on his feet. So there's a possibility also that Beowulf may be there to help him as part of repaying the debt that his father had from when he was, in trouble. So he says, I used to know him, and so on and so forth. The guard comes back, and then he brings Beowulf in. I think I already mentioned this about the hall lying deserted, and I put over here a metaphor for power, and I already talked about that in terms of the mead hall being important for them as a community, and then what it means when they have to abandon it in terms of their community. So Beowulf goes in, he finally gets to talk to Hrothgar, and he goes through this whole like description of all the things that he's done, and it gets a little braggy. I mean, to 2021 standards, it's a little braggy. We wouldn't brag like that. We would let our moms brag about us, but we don't go in and give our resume to people. These are all the things that I've done. But he's slaughtered sea brutes and gone through all these complicated battle scenarios and so on. And the reason he mentions that is it's a boast that's meant to express to Hrothgar that he's capable of this job, that he's capable of taking care of this monster. So he talks about that for a while. There's this big long description of all the things that he can do, and Hrothgar accepts his help and says, well, we could definitely use your help to kill this monster. At the feast, though, there's a subtext element. So even though Hrothgar, enthusiastically accepts Beowulf's help, at the feast, there's a little underbelly of resentment, I guess we could say, among the other men there, the Danish men. Because they decide, oh, let's have a feast, let's go to the hall and we'll open it up and we'll have food. It's daytime, so you don't have to worry about it. We'll give you this big party. And at the party, this guy, Unferth, tries to shame Beowulf, right? He tries to say, are you the same Beowulf that couldn't even beat Brecca at a swimming match? Are you the same guy that lost that? Like, how do you expect to kill a monster if you can't even win a swimming match, especially after all that other stuff that you just listed that you could do? And probably part of that is pride. Unferth and all the other Danes haven't been able to do anything to get rid of Grendel. And that is probably a source of, sore pride for them that they haven't been able to do that. And here comes this guy who says, oh, I'll take care of your monster. I'm here to do it. I'm here to, exterminate your creature. And Unferth is resentful of that. And so he says, are you the one who lost this swimming match? And he talks about all that. And Beowulf answers him like here on line 530. And basically Beowulf puts him in his place. He says, number one, I think you're drunk. Number two, I did technically lose the battle or the competition with Brecca in swimming. On the 5th day of our swimming, because they were swimming for 5 days, as people do, it's probably exaggerated. On the 5th day, we were neck and neck. We were coming to the end of our swimming competition, and there were all these sea brutes that showed up. And so I had to get my sword. They were swimming with their swords for some reason. This is how you know it's a legend and not real. And I broke away from Brecca so that I could save humanity by killing these sea brutes. So yeah, he beat me, but ultimately, who's the better person since I saved everybody from, the potential death by sea brutes. And besides, he says, he describes the whole thing to them. He says, besides, if you're that great, how come you haven't killed Grendel? Mic drop, end of conversation. And that's pretty much it. He said, this monster's gone unchecked for 12 years and you haven't done anything about it. So what do you care about a swimming match? But there is that underlying kind of resentment. I don't think Unferth is the only one who has that. It's just that Hrothgar, the great king, has been brought so low by Grendel that he's willing to accept help without resentment, because he needs to get his mead hall back for his people. So they have dinner, they drink. Beowulf makes this formal boast, starting here on the bottom of page 46. And he does this formal boast where he promises this. The formal boast is like him promising that he's going to kill the monster or die trying, basically. And that's an Anglo-Saxon thing. It's like the contract. I'm here, I'm going to kill your creature. They have this, rest of the party and so on, and it gets late. And then they're pretty sure that Grendel's going to show up that evening, because that's what he does. He comes to the mead hall whenever there's people in it. And Hrothgar leaves and his men, and Beowulf and his men are left in this section called the Fight with Grendel. They're left there to wait for the monster's arrival. I mean, like, they're not wasting any time. They know that their reveling in the mead hall is going to bring Grendel to it. So before they settle in, Beowulf says to his men, I've decided that I'm not going to use any weapons, which is a little surprising, because you would think against a monster that could take up 30 Viking warriors at once, you might want a sword. But Beowulf says, I think that I need to fight him the way he fights. So it's going to be more of a wrestling match. And he says, no weapons, therefore. So they lay down and they pretend like they're going to go to sleep, all of them thinking that they're going to die that night because of all the stories they've heard from the Danes. And sure enough, here comes Grendel, and he comes out, out of the shadows through the mist. And there's this description of how he's greedily loping, through the forest to get to the mead hall. He gets there and he, pounds open the doors, and he grabs the first man that's right there, one of Beowulf's men, and immediately just sort of like rips him apart piece by piece and just shoves him in his mouth, like a chicken wing, right? Like you would just rip up a chicken wing and eat the meat, and he just eats the whole thing. And as gross as that is, it gives Beowulf a minute to figure out how the monster works. He has to sacrifice a man for it. But after he's done devouring that first man, Grendel reaches for the next one, which happens to be Beowulf. And as he reaches, Beowulf grabs back. And Beowulf's superpower is that he's super strong. He's got the strength of 30. It's probably exaggerated through time, right? And so as Grendel is surprised that there's such a grip back at him, because he's used to going there and just feasting, Beowulf gets a better grip on the creature's arm, and now he is stuck. And so they grapple around in the room. Beowulf has a hold of his arm and doesn't let go, and they're crashing in the mead hall back and forth. There's a lot of really great description of this battle. Fingers bursting. This is line 759. The monster backtracking, the man overpowering the dread of the land, was desperate to escape. The dread of the land is Grendel, right? That's a phrase that is used to replace the name Grendel. And was desperate to escape, to take roundabout road and flee. So he's scared. He can't get away from this grip of this man. And so he starts to bash him against the walls. He starts screaming. Grendel starts screaming, and he lets out this piercing sound. And what Grendel actually does is, like an animal in a trap, he allows his arm to be pulled off of his body. So he leverages his arm away from Beowulf, and it rips off, right? So, everything stretches out, and then his arm, and a God-cursed scream and strain of catastrophe, the howl of the loser, and he goes running away back to he's got this like underwater cave lair under this marshy fen, they call it in the text. So this assumption is that, here's where that part, sinews split and the bone lappings burst. Beowulf was granted the glory of winning. Grendel was driven under the fen banks, fatally hurt. Well, he's gonna die. You could probably survive if your arm ripped off nowadays because we have hospitals, but they didn't have hospitals, and they definitely didn't have monster hospitals. So as he runs back, he's losing more and more blood, and the assumption is that he just bleeds out down in his lair. He leaves his arm behind. Beowulf takes the arm and puts it up in the rafters as like a symbol of his accomplishment. And they celebrate that the monster is dead. And that's the end of that part. So I think there are some symbolism elements to note. We talked about characterization, genealogy, sort of like the exposition of this piece. Are there any parts that as you were reading, I didn't go into here, but you want me to talk about? Any line numbers that you want me to go back to, or any questions about anything? Don't assume that the things that I talk about are the only things that are going to be pertinent. I'm just kind of giving you some background on the areas that I think need some clarification. No? Okay, well, on Tuesday, I'm going to talk about the remainder of Beowulf. Please note that there are 2 sections of the text that you do not need to read. There's a gap between the ending part for this section that ends on page 94 of the PDF. The beginning part of the next section is 104. So you can skip ahead 10 pages to 104 and continue reading there. And then there's another break between 112 and 123. So you do not need to read those parts. On Tuesday, I'll tell you what happens in those parts just so for your information, but you don't have to read them for preparation on Tuesday. There are also some notes. After Tuesday, we're going to move on to the Middle Ages. So there's some notes about the Middle Ages and the background that you need to read. I'll touch on that a little bit, and then kind of go through Beowulf the same way that I did today for the second half. You can also look ahead. There's a lot of reading assignments every day. There's something to read, so you can always, get ahead if you have time. But everything's laid out for next week. If there aren't any questions, then I guess that's it for today. Hopefully the background today and the overview helped you. But do communicate with me if you have any more questions, and I hope that you have a good weekend. Bye.
Bye, Miss.
Bye, have a good day.